One thing, when I was in the military, I think I took character for granted because most of what I saw in the military was pretty darn good character. There were cases where people would do things, that you didn't like or you don't approve of. But in general, it was very, very good. Now, it doesn't mean that in the commercial or civilian world that it's not. What it means is, I think just in the 15 years since I have left the service, we've let the idea of character erode in our society. And what I mean by erode is things which before, there was a certain number of people doing, but they weren't approved of. They weren't accepted. The popular term now is they weren't normalized. And now when I see public figures doing levels of behavior that just wouldn't be acceptable before, when I see politicians looking at us in the eye, through the camera, of course, and saying things that they know aren't true, and they know we know aren't true, and yet we have this strange agreement where because they're politicians, we allow that. I think we've allowed it to erode, and it's at a point now where it's become dangerous.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonppbc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's aditonppbc.com/FTGN-LOGE. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome back to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and today we're diving into the notebook of General Retired Stanley McChrystal as he discusses his new book on character, Choices That Define a Life. Now, as of Monday, this interview wasn't a thing. I had the opportunity this week, yesterday, matter of fact, to travel to DC to interview the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, for an upcoming special 250th birthday episode. I reached out to General McChrystal, and luckily the timing of his release with his new book was the same time I was going up there. So I got to sit down with him for about 25 minutes at the McChrystal Group. We talk about what it means to have character. He sees it as your convictions times discipline. Convictions are those things that you reflected on, think about, care deeply for, willing to fight for, and the discipline to see those through no matter the circumstances. So we have a great conversation about character. We talk about his reading and reflecting habits and talk about some of the lessons that he's learned and, things that he could go back and do differently if he had the opportunity to. So I hope you enjoy this interview. This was an amazing honor for me to get the opportunity to do this. So please grab your green notebooks and welcome to the show, General Stanley McChrystal.
Joe, it's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sir, I devoured on character, and the first question that popped in my head was, would Major McChrystal or Colonel McChrystal have read this book, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think either of them could have written the book. I'd like to believe that they would have read it, particularly if somebody had recommended it to them, because I liked to read sort of broadly or eclectically when I was younger, but I couldn't have written it because I just don't think at that point in my life I use the term circumspect enough. When you're living the life, it's kind of hard to have real broad visibility, and I was in the military career trying to do that well. So I think it needed a little bit more time.
Well, that's good. And then as you've reflected now, it's been 20 years now, almost 20 since retirement. 15. Sorry, I don't want to.
No, that's a long time now.
Yeah. But so as you've looked at character now,
yeah.
How do you see that?
One thing, when I was in the military, I think I took character for granted because most of what I saw in the military was pretty darn good character. There were cases where people would do things, that you didn't like or you don't approve of. But in general, it was very, very good. Now, it doesn't mean that in the commercial or civilian world that it's not. What it means is, I think just in the 15 years since I have left the service, we've let the idea of character erode in our society. And what I mean by erode is things which before, there was a certain number of people doing, but they weren't approved of. They weren't accepted. The popular term now is they weren't normalized. And now when I see public figures doing levels of behavior that just wouldn't be acceptable before, when I see politicians looking at us in the eye, through the camera, of course, and saying things that they know aren't true, and they know we know aren't true, and yet we have this strange agreement where because they're politicians, we allow that. I think we've allowed it to erode, and it's at a point now where it's become dangerous because the lack of trust, as we see in institutions and people, is huge. You know from your military experience, if you don't trust somebody you rely on, then you change the relationship. I talk about people in the foxhole. If you don't trust the other person in the foxhole to stay awake when they should, you never sleep. You never clean your weapon. And so society just doesn't work unless we have some norms, unless we have some rules that we feel we need to live to.
So how do you determine character then?
Yeah. I think in my experience, you get to know somebody and you start to develop this sort of indistinct appreciation of their character. And we all knew people who were sort of out of control or scoundrels. But in one way, we actually trusted them because they may have one aspect of them that you sort of didn't really like, but there was something core there that you knew in a very difficult situation, they would come for you if you needed them to. I've made it a little bit more mathematical now.
Right.
I've broken it down into a formula that says character is your convictions times your discipline to live to them. But when I talk about convictions, I'm not talking about just things that you've heard and you believe and you sort of accept as fact. I'm talking about those things which you've actually thought about and you've decided are very, very important, and you believe in those, your core strong beliefs. And I describe it as those things which you're willing to live to or die for. And then the other part is the discipline you have to actually follow through. So a lot of people will say or write their convictions, But they're meaningless because, in fact, when the hard wind blows, they blow as well. And I think many of us aren't sure about either of those. We're not sure what our convictions are because we haven't thought about them enough. And I think convictions, as I get older, I can use bigger terms, the dialectic. I think your best convictions are ones you've discussed with people or in your own head and really pushed and pulled on. But also, we're not sure just how much our discipline will withstand pressure. You know, of course, you and I have been talking about Vietnam era prisoners of war who were put in this extraordinary position, which they're essentially isolated and tortured and have no clear outcome into the war. And would we have the discipline, or in this case, call it courage, to hold to our convictions in that kind of environment? And so I think many of us don't know our discipline until we've tested it.
And you know, as I was thinking back, I didn't start journaling till 2020, like when COVID hit the pause button on the world, and I really needed it. And it wasn't until I sat down with my thoughts and actually started writing things down where I actually started learning and seeing the things on the piece of paper that I was passionate about and that like I actually valued, not things that I just stated because they felt good. How have you come to determine what are those things that you're convicted about?
Yeah, I'm smiling as you say that because that's been my experience as well. If you'd have asked me a few years ago how I feel about the ends justifying the means, I think my initial response was, no, they don't. Because although you may want those ends, if we are doing things we shouldn't for those ends, we're just not the people we want and claim to be. But when I tried to write that, and I tried to write that out, and I had the argument with myself, I actually came to the conclusion that, one of my beliefs is, thou shalt not kill. But I have. Another belief we all have is, I will never lie. West Point, of course, beat that into us. But I have. And then I come back and I say, well, maybe I will never do those things unless I feel like I need to. And then you suddenly get complicated because now the ends are justifying the means. I'm not trying to trivialize the idea that we need those core convictions that we live to, but I'm trying to admit that life is not black and white, at least not for me. And when I had to write them, and I had to make an argument that would stand my scrutiny, and hopefully the scrutiny of others, I had to be more realistic. And that was a good process for me. I wish I'd done that when I was very young.
Same. I wish I would have done that when I was younger. And the other thing about journaling, and you talk about this a little bit on the book as a commander, but I can tell you all day that, hey, sir, I value this and I value that, and this is important to me. But my journal and my schedule is a record of that, and that the paper does not lie.
Right.
And so, you did the same thing in Afghanistan with, if I'm saying this is important.
Yeah, we did my schedule, and what we did was at the beginning of every month, I would give my priorities out, and we'd break it into what percentage of my time was I going to spend doing each of a number of things. And then at the end of the month, we'd come together, and they had these pie charts that would show, okay, you said you were going to spend 30% of your time on this, you spent 50. And it was something not very important, that sort of thing. And you go, I'm going to fix it. And each month, you try to fix it, and you make progress. You never get it perfect. But what I didn't do, which I wish I'd done earlier, I wish I'd journaled from the very beginning of my career. And the reason is you develop a memory of something or an opinion of somebody. But if you really had tracked that back, almost the history of it, I think it would make your opinion more complete and probably more mature.
One of the, in addition to journaling, one of the things that you talk about in the book too, like thinking and reading, how has your reading habit changed over the years?
Yeah, one of the things I'm lucky about, when I was young, I loved to read, and my mother was a voracious reader, and she would feed me books, and she was into mythology and heroes of the Greek and ancient era and whatnot, and so I grew up partially on that, and then I grew up on biographies. I liked history a lot, so I started at a young age reading history. In fact, it was funny, I went to West Point, in the summer '72, and it was very engineering focused and math and whatnot. And in the time I had to study, when I should have been studying math, which I didn't understand, I was reading biographies. I read Ulysses Grant's biography then, which wasn't very helpful actually at that point in my education. So the reading part has been very, very good to me. And then when I deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq for so long, I got into audiobooks, and I had this rhythm where Annie would get every audiobook, because they were only on CDs at the beginning, and she would load them onto this laptop, and then about every 2 months she'd send a new laptop over to me with all these audiobooks, and I could put on my iPod. And so when I got up in the morning, I had a little set of speakers with a slot for an iPod, and I'd put it in there, and I'd listen from the moment I woke up as I got dressed, shaved, and all that. Then when I went to work out, I would listen to books the whole time. And then when I came back and got cleaned up, and so I was going through this wide range of books. And, I remember Don Quixote, 50 CDs, long book.
That's a commitment.
Yeah, and after a while you get tired of Don Quixote and Sancho. But the reality is, I would read biographies. I would just read eclectically, and I really liked that. And particularly when we were in the intense experience of war, I didn't want to just read military history. I wanted to read different things because maybe it was my escape.
Yeah. I was, speaking of audio, like I can listen, like I've listened to On Character on audio, but in order for me to retain it, I have to have the physical copy to go back and take notes and highlight in. And so this weekend I went on a road trip with my son. I was speaking at the Air War College graduation ball, and I dropped him off at Fort Benning so he could hang out with a friend all weekend that we served with in Germany. And I had the book in the back. I was listening to Rick Atkinson's new Revolutionary War book, the second one in the trilogy. And every time there was something in the book that I wanted to remember, I made him flip to it and find it and highlight it for me. He hated that additional duty.
I love Rick Atkinson's book. I'm looking forward to that. But I'm the same way. I don't retain the same amount in audio that I do when I read. But I do often do it complimentary, a little like you. I don't have a son to, my son wouldn't do that. But sometimes I'll listen to the book, but I'll have the hard copy that I go and I just do. Plus there are maps and other things that are helpful.
Yeah, and how is your, I guess like your scope of reading, has that changed since you've retired?
Probably not. I still read eclectically. I typically am reading 3 books at once.
Okay.
I've got one by the bedstead, which take me a long time because I only do a few pages before I fall asleep. I have one in the living room that I have this little stand that I put in, and that's very comfortable to read. And then I have an audiobook that I'm listening to. I have a Kindle, but I only use it occasionally. But I find that those 3 I kind of juggle as I go. And then I read a lot of books because a fair number of particularly veterans ask me to endorse their book.
Right.
And I force myself to read every word of a book before I'll put my name endorsing it. And I learned so much. There's some really good books that come through.
I just remember this. I totally forgot this. But in 2021, I published a book called My Green Notebook, Know Thyself Before Changing Jobs. And it was a very simple 30-day journal with 2 questions a day. But I remember that. I totally forgot about it. You endorsed that book. And people have been using it for years, so thank you.
Well, you're kind. It's fun to read a bunch of stuff you wouldn't otherwise read, because if you only read the things that are most interesting to you, there's a whole bunch of things you ought to read. And I also read a bunch of books my wife tells me to read. She has it and she shoves it. I just finished Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, very personal story of her marriage.
Okay.
But it's really a history of the 1960s because her husband was a famous speechwriter. And it was fascinating. But I wouldn't have read it unless Annie had said, and she reads more than anybody I know, so.
I'm the same way. Amanda will recommend books. And I appreciate in the book you included, speaking of Annie, her mixing up idioms.
Oh, yeah.
I called Amanda last night to tell her about one that you mentioned in the book. And I think we were having a conversation the other day, and Amanda goes like, all right, let's set the table. And I was like, or no, let's clear the clear the table. And I was like, I think it's clear the air.
Where are you going with that? You know? And the thing that's funny, Annie will say one of those, and I'll look at her, and she'll just start laughing.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, I want to talk about, I know like we're short on time, but one of the things that you talk about in the book that I think is so important are emotions and anger when it comes to leadership. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and I think we all go on a leadership journey there. When I was young, first a lieutenant, it was still popular for commanders to show anger. And those were non-secure FM radio communications. I remember senior people would get on the radio and just melt it down, and with incredible language.
Did you break a lot of hand mics back in the day?
Yeah, I think we all did. And it was a sign of power, I think, because they could get angry, and it also, I think they were trying to show righteousness, that they had the right answer. They couldn't believe everybody. I had a battalion commander who used to call a subordinate unit on the radio, and when the RTO'd answered, he'd go, put somebody smart on the radio. And you just stop back and think, and most people laughed it off, but if you were a young soldier, but people would lose their temper, and I tried it as a young leader as well. People would jump and they'd run around, but every time you did it, they reacted less. And then after a while, if that's just what you do, people don't much react. And they stop respecting you. And so what I learned is really from watching really good leaders, it's okay if they're angry. And you know that they're very frustrated and angry, but they're not emotive about it. You know, they might clench their jaw and look at you and say, Joe, next time we're gonna do this better, right? That is far more powerful to me than if somebody starts spitting and doing all that kind of thing. Because you wanna please them, and you know you've disappointed them and disappointed yourself.
Yeah, I don't think, when I was reading that chapter, I don't think General Miller ever yelled at me when I was working for him, but he did say he was disappointed.
Yeah.
And I think that was like the weight of that.
That's right. It's extraordinary what that'll do.
Well, as you look back on your career, what are a couple of things you think you would have done differently? Yeah. And I recognize too that the story had to go a certain way for you to get to this point to where you're at in your own life.
Yeah. When I was young, I didn't take certain things seriously enough. You know, I got into West Point because my father had been there. I wanted to go there. I wanted to be my father. And then my first 2 years at West Point, I was as irresponsible as you could be. I got in discipline trouble. I almost flunked out because I didn't study. It wasn't because I was stupid, but I just didn't study and I didn't know math. And so I think about it, and now I go up and I talk to the cadets and I make a joke about how bad I was in math and how much trouble I got into. But I was that close to getting thrown out. And if I'd been thrown out, everything I wanted would have been gone. And it wouldn't be a funny joke over a beer. Now, because I did make it, it is. So the first thing was figure out what's important and value that. Same things with marriage, relationships with friends, family. If they're really important, show them the respect that you're going to treat them correctly, the whole relationship correctly. I think the second thing is I'd be better prepared. That sounds, I worked hard, I really did. But the reality was, just like I did at West Point, I was just bright enough to get by with being unprepared in many cases. I could kind of fake it through stuff. And they taught you most of what you did in the classroom, so you didn't really have to study as hard as people think you did. And through my career, had I been more prepared for certain events and times, I'd have been more successful. And it's easy to go back and say, I don't know if I'd have worked harder, but I'd have worked with more intentionality to prepare for the things that really mattered. Sometimes you don't because you don't want to, they're unpleasant, you just don't want to mess with it. And those are the things that I wish I'd done. If I could rerun the whole thing, I would do those two things differently.
Well, one last question. And, I've been looking a lot lately into power. I've been reading everything that Plutarch wrote, looking at Plato, the Republic. And I don't think that we appreciate when we're young and ambitious the thing that power does to us, whether power corrupts, whether power reveals. So when it comes to character, what is one piece of advice that you would offer to the ambitious, rising professional in the private sector or a rising professional in the military who's a company grade officer or mid-level NCO right now when it comes to preparing their character for the power that they will one day possess? Yeah,
I think you summarize it well. Power is unbelievably strong. And the power just to convince people, the power to charm people, the power to convince people, the power to do whatever it is you develop the skills to do. You and I know from the military, if you are a pretty good leader, you can get soldiers to do anything. You can get them to do the most courageous things that you want, and you can get them to do the most evil things. And it's just up to you. Once you get the power, the ability to do that, you have the tools, you suddenly have this responsibility that is almost frightening because you can take them to a much better place or you can take them to a much worse place. And if you're sensitive to that, you can see it in other people too. You can see the power that effective leaders, not good leaders in terms of good or bad as a moral sense, but someone who's effective at it, because we saw terrorist leaders, we see other people who can lead groups, organizations, nations in a completely negative direction. So to me, power is kryptonite on steroids. And yet we spend time trying to get it so that we have it. And I'm not sure we all appreciate just how serious it is.
Well, I think one of the things during preparation, as people prepare for these positions, I think one of the benefits of reading on character is that there wasn't a chapter in here where I didn't look inward on to see where I fell on your conviction scale. And so, again, appreciate you writing it and taking the lessons that you've learned over a glorious career, a long life, and then sharing it with all of us.
Well, Joe, thanks so much. And I appreciate you reading it. And as I tried to put in the book, there are no answers in that book, but there are questions that proved valuable for me to explore. So I invite every reader just to explore them themselves.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud, there's dirt on my